When my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't act like the owner," I almost laughed. She thought I was just an old woman, living under her son's roof out of pity. But she didn't know the truth. The house she strutted around in was mine, and it always had been. That night, I poured myself a cup of tea, opened my filing cabinet, and pulled out one document that would turn her smug smile into stunned silence the very next day. My name is Linda Parker, and at 62 years old, I thought I had seen enough of life to understand where I stood. I was a retired elementary school teacher, a widow for almost a decade, and the proud owner of a 2-story home in a quiet suburb of Denver. My house wasn't fancy, but it had history. Every inch of it held memories of my late husband, Robert, and of raising our only child, Mark. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon on winter mornings. The garden out back bloomed with roses Robert planted before he passed. The creaky third step on the staircase was one he used to promise he'd fix, but never did. That step still creaked, and in some strange way, I loved it for that. I'd been living alone since Robert's death, and while there were lonely days, I had built a comfortable life. My mornings started with coffee on the porch, watching the sun creep over the quiet street. Afternoons were for tending the roses, chatting with my neighbor Carol, and volunteering at the local library. I paid my bills on time, I drove myself where I needed to go, and most importantly, I kept my independence. Mark, my son, had grown into a good man. He worked in IT, a career that kept him busy, but we spoke every week. When he married Melissa 2 years ago, I was overjoyed. Melissa was smart, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely caring. She worked in marketing and always had a polished smile. At family dinners, she would compliment my cooking, bring me small gifts, and ask about my health. She had a way of making everyone feel comfortable, and I believed she was sincere. When Mark and Melissa bought their first house, a modest 3-bedroom across town, I felt proud. They invited me over often, and I enjoyed watching them build their life together. Still, I loved returning to my own home at the end of the day, to my quiet evenings and my routines. Things began to change last winter when Melissa suggested over dinner that I consider moving in with them. "It's just that we'd love to have you closer," she said, her hand resting lightly on mine. "It would make it easier for us to help you if you ever needed anything, and it would be so wonderful for the baby to have his grandmother around all the time." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sick. I wasn't struggling financially. I had my own space. But Melissa's words tugged at my heart. The thought of being near my grandson every day was tempting. Mark chimed in, saying it would also save me from the upkeep of my house, which was getting harder for me to manage alone. I told them I'd think about it. That night, I walked through my home, running my fingers over the furniture, pausing by family photos on the walls. The house felt warm but a little emptier than it used to. Perhaps a change would be good. A month later, I agreed. I kept my house but arranged to rent it out to a young couple, thinking it would give me some extra income. I packed my essentials, some keepsakes, and moved into the guest room of Mark and Melissa's home. The first weeks were surprisingly smooth. Melissa made an effort to make me feel welcome. She cleared out closet space, placed fresh flowers in the room, and even asked me to teach her my famous apple pie recipe. We spent afternoons in the kitchen, laughing as she tried to get the crust just right. I told myself I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law who cared enough to include me, lucky to watch my grandson grow day by day. In those early days, life felt full. I took my grandson to the park, picked him up from preschool when Melissa had late meetings, and cooked family dinners when Mark worked late. The house bustled with life, and for the first time in years, I felt part of a household again. Melissa often expressed her gratitude. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. Her words warmed me. I told myself I was exactly where I was meant to be. Looking back now, I see how easy it was to believe everything was perfect. I didn't notice small things, the way Melissa always positioned herself as the one making decisions in the house, how she sometimes referred to my room as the guest room, even though I'd been there for months, how she subtly shifted responsibilities in a way that made me more like a live-in helper than an equal member of the home. At the time, none of it seemed like a problem. I was happy. I was with my family. And in my heart, I truly believed Melissa's invitation had come from a place of love and respect. If only I had known what was coming next. The first few weeks in Mark and Melissa's home felt like a seamless transition. Melissa was accommodating, cheerful, and organized. She had a knack for keeping the household in order. Meals planned, the pantry stocked, bills paid on time. I admired her efficiency. Mark, on the other hand, was as busy as ever. His IT projects often kept him working long hours, sometimes late into the night. Even so, he made time to check in with me, asking if I was comfortable, if I needed anything. Melissa made an effort to include me in her routines. She asked me to accompany her to the grocery store, often seeking my opinion on recipes. She invited me into conversations about my grandson's schooling, even suggesting I could pick him up on days she had meetings. It felt nice to be needed, and I believed my presence was making life easier for them. But after a while, subtle changes began to catch my attention. Melissa started handling all the household finances. At first, it made sense. Mark was busy and Melissa was meticulous with details. I even thought it was admirable. But I noticed she not only paid the bills, but also kept all financial information in her personal office. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table balancing my own modest accounts, Melissa breezed in and mentioned casually, "Oh, I paid the property taxes yesterday. It's just easier if I handle it all together." I froze for a second. The property taxes? On my house? The one I still owned? I smiled politely, choosing not to make an issue of it, but I made a mental note. Then came the conversation about space. My room was comfortable enough, a guest room at the end of the hallway. One evening, as Melissa was folding laundry, she mentioned, "We're thinking of turning the spare room into an office for Mark. It would be so helpful if you moved your things into the smaller room near the back. It's cozier and you'd have more privacy." The smaller room she referred to was barely big enough for a bed and dresser. I hesitated but agreed. It didn't seem worth arguing over. After all, it was just a room. The kitchen, too, slowly became a shared but managed space. Melissa preferred cooking dinner herself, which I respected, but gradually her preferences turned into boundaries. "I just find it easier if the kitchen is clear between 5 and 7, she said one evening, her tone cheerful but firm. "It's when I'm really in the zone with dinner." So I adjusted my routine. I cooked earlier or later. It was fine, I told myself. I was a guest in their home, even if Melissa insisted I was family. I noticed other small things. My framed photos of Robert and Mark were moved from the living room shelves to my bedroom. Melissa explained it as making room for new memory, and I accepted it, even though it stung. Mark, oblivious to these changes, remained his usual self, kind but distracted by work. When I mentioned some of the adjustments to him, he nodded absent-mindedly, saying, "Melissa just likes things organized. You know how she is." And I did know. Melissa liked order. She liked control. Still, none of this felt malicious, at least not yet. I told myself I was reading too much into things. I reminded myself that Melissa had invited me into her home, that she was letting me be a part of their daily lives. But there was a subtle shift I couldn't quite ignore. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a feeling. A quiet undercurrent that I was no longer an equal presence in the household, but a supporting character in someone else's carefully directed story. I brushed it aside. After all, I had my family around me, a roof over my head, and my grandson's laughter filling my days. What more could I ask for? If only I had realized then that these little adjustments were the first notes in a much larger symphony Melissa was conducting. It was a Saturday evening, one of those rare occasions when the dining room was full. Mark had invited a few of their close friends and neighbors for dinner, and Melissa, of course, was the perfect hostess. The table was set with her finest dishes, candles flickered gently, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh herbs filled the air. I had helped prepare an apple pie earlier that afternoon, though Melissa insisted she'd handle the main course. The atmosphere was light at first. People laughed, shared stories, and complimented Melissa's cooking. I smiled, happy to see the house so lively. This, I thought, was what family gatherings should feel like. As we ate, someone mentioned the kitchen layout, saying how functional it seemed. Melissa laughed and agreed, explaining how she'd organized the cabinets to make everything more efficient. I took a sip of water and said lightly, "I was actually thinking maybe we could add a small shelf above the counter. It'd be useful for spices and free up some space. I can even help with the installation. Robert and I added similar shelves in my old kitchen." It was a simple suggestion, meant to be helpful. Melissa's fork paused mid-air. Her smile stayed in place, but her tone changed, just slightly sharper. "Linda," she said, still smiling but with an edge in her voice, "don't act like the owner here." For a moment, the room fell completely silent. I blinked, unsure I'd heard her correctly. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The neighbor couple sitting across the table looked down at their plates. One of Mark's friends coughed awkwardly. Mark himself froze, then glanced at Melissa, but said nothing. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I managed a small, polite smile, but my heart was pounding. "I was only suggesting," I said quietly. Melissa gave a light laugh, as if brushing off the comment. "Of course. I just meant we've got everything covered, but thank you for the idea." The conversation quickly shifted to something else, but the damage was done. My appetite vanished. I pushed food around my plate, nodding occasionally as the others talked, but my mind was elsewhere. In my head, her words replayed over and over. "Don't act like the owner here." It wasn't just a comment about a shelf. It was a line drawn in the sand. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I helped clear the table, excusing myself to the kitchen. As I rinsed plates, I could hear laughter drifting from the dining room. Melissa's voice was the loudest, confident, and unbothered. Mark came in briefly to bring more dishes. I considered saying something, but the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? That my daughter-in-law had just stripped me of my dignity in front of a table full of people, including him, and he said nothing? Instead, I smiled faintly and asked how work was going. After the guests left, Melissa thanked me for the pie. "Everyone loved it," she said warmly, as though nothing had happened. I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm glad." That night, in the quiet of my small room, I sat on the bed and thought about the evening. My chest ached, not from anger exactly, but from something deeper, a kind of loss. This wasn't about a shelf or even the comment itself. It was the realization that, in Melissa's eyes, I wasn't a respected member of the household. I was a guest, a tolerated presence, and Mark's silence had said just as much. Lying in bed, I told myself, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Melissa hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But another part of me, the part that had lived long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, knew better. That night marked a shift, a small crack in the surface that had, until now, seemed so smooth. I didn't know then how wide that crack would grow or how deep it would run. That night after the dinner, I sat in my small room with the door closed, my thoughts as loud as the silence around me. I'd been in this house for months now, but after Melissa's words, "Don't act like the owner here," it no longer felt like a home. It felt like I was trespassing in a place I had been invited to under false pretenses. I replayed the scene in my mind, the way her smile didn't falter when she said it, the way everyone avoided my eyes, the way Mark said nothing. I had raised that man to respect his mother, to stand up when something was wrong. His silence spoke volumes. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. A familiar ache settled in my chest, the kind that comes from feeling unseen, unheard. I thought about my old house, the one I had rented out. Every creaky floorboard, every chipped tile in the kitchen was mine. I had been the one to pay for it, maintain it, live in it. Now, here I was, in a house where my presence felt conditional, my place fragile. The next morning, Melissa acted as though nothing had happened. She made coffee, chatted about her plans for the day, and even offered me a slice of banana bread she'd baked. I accepted it, smiling faintly, but my mind was still stuck on her words. Mark, on the other hand, avoided the subject entirely. Over breakfast, I asked if everything went well last night. He nodded. Yeah, Melissa did a great job hosting. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. That was it. No mention of the comment, no acknowledgement of the awkward silence that followed. I wanted to ask him directly, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you defend me? But I swallowed the questions. It was clear he wasn't ready to address it. Or maybe he didn't see it as a problem. As the days passed, I noticed my behavior subtly changing. I hesitated before speaking up about household matters. I thought twice before suggesting any changes, even something as simple as moving a chair or adjusting a picture frame. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in a place that was supposed to be my safe space. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about what they implied. Melissa had drawn a boundary, not just in that moment, but in the entire dynamic of the household. She had positioned herself as the authority, and I was meant to stay in my lane. In the quiet moments, I began to wonder, was this always her plan? To invite me in, make me comfortable, then slowly edge me out of any real sense of belonging? The thought seemed paranoid, but something in my gut told me I needed to pay closer attention. One afternoon, I overheard Melissa on the phone in the living room. Her tone was calm but assertive. Yes, once everything is in place, we can make the move. It'll be cleaner that way. I couldn't hear the rest, but my stomach tightened. I started noticing more. Melissa handled all the mail. She kept household documents in her office. When I asked if she needed help organizing bills, she smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I've got it all under control." Mark, as usual, stayed absorbed in work. He came home late, tired, grateful that Melissa kept things running smoothly. When I brought up small concerns, he reassured me with a distracted, "Melissa knows what she's doing." That was the moment I realized something important. I was alone in this. Melissa's words at the dinner weren't a slip of the tongue. They were intentional. Whether Mark saw it or not, whether he wanted to admit it or not, there was a shift happening in this house, and I was on the losing end of it. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't confront Melissa, not yet, but I would start paying attention, closely. I would watch, listen, and gather whatever I needed to understand exactly what was going on. For now, I would smile. I would play along, but I would no longer assume that my place here was safe just because I was family. And for the first time since moving in, I felt the faint stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years. Determination. The shift started subtly, as most things do. A few days after that dinner, I was pruning the roses in the front yard when I heard Melissa chatting with our neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. They were standing by the mailbox, their voices carrying over the hedge. "Oh, we just love this place," Melissa said brightly. "It's our first real home, you know? Mark and I have so many plans for renovations, maybe even a new deck out back." Our home. I froze mid-snip. It was a small phrase, but it clung to me. She didn't say the house or Mark's house. She said our home, as if it belonged equally to both of them. I stayed quiet, pretending to focus on the roses, but my ears stayed sharp. Mrs. Whitaker complimented the garden, saying how nice it was to have me there to help. Melissa laughed lightly. "Yes, Linda's been staying with us for a while now. She's great with the plants, but we'll probably make some landscaping changes when we redo the backyard." The word staying landed hard. I felt the prickle of unease again. I tried to shake it off. After all, maybe she didn't mean anything by it. But something about the way she phrased things made me feel like a temporary guest. Later that week, I was in the hallway outside the kitchen when I overheard Melissa on the phone. Her tone was more serious than usual, less sugary than when she spoke to neighbors. "Yes, once we sell this place, we'll have enough for a down payment on the new house. It'll be cleaner if the title is just in our names this time," she said, pacing slowly. I stood frozen, my hand resting on the wall for balance. "Sell this place? Title in their names?" She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. No, she doesn't need to know all the details right now. It's better to keep things simple." My stomach twisted. I stepped quietly back into my room before she could see me. That night, I sat at my small desk, staring at my planner. My name was still on the deed to my old home, the one I had rented out. But this house, technically, it was Mark and Melissa's purchase, yet I had contributed money over the years. I had even helped cover some of the mortgage payments when Mark was in between jobs. I didn't know what Melissa's legal footing was, but I suddenly felt a desperate need to find out. The next morning, when Melissa took my grandson to daycare, I drove to my old house. The tenants were out for the day, and I went to the storage unit in the garage where I kept some of my important documents. I found my old file box flipping through manila folders labeled mortgage, property taxes, and insurance. I realized I still had copies of the financial transfers I'd made to Mark over the years, some of which were specifically earmarked for this house. That afternoon, I called my old friend Harold, a retired attorney who had handled Robert's estate years ago. I told him I needed to review some property details. Harold agreed to meet me later in the week. In the meantime, I started paying closer attention to Melissa's behavior. She handled all the mail that came in. She kept certain documents in her office, which she always kept locked. When I offered to help with bills, she smiled sweetly and said, "Oh, Linda, you've done enough for us. Let me take care of the boring stuff." Every time she said things like that, the unease in my chest grew heavier. One evening, as I was washing dishes, I heard her in the living room on another call. "Yes, I've already started looking at new listings. Mark loves that Craftsman on Oak Street. It'll be perfect once we finalize everything here." Finalize everything here. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. The comment at dinner, the conversations with the neighbor, the phone calls, piece by piece, they were forming a picture, and I didn't like what I was seeing. I decided it was time to stop ignoring the warning signs. The next day, I gathered all my documents, the copies of my financial contributions, the old title to my own house, and my notes on Melissa's recent comments. I placed them in a neat folder. I wasn't sure exactly what Melissa was planning, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let myself be blindsided. This time, I would be ready. The following Thursday, I drove to Harold's office with the folder of documents on the passenger seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than I intended. Harold had been Robert's lawyer for years, and someone I trusted. If anyone could help me make sense of what was going on, it was him. When I arrived, Harold greeted me warmly. "Linda, it's been too long. What brings you here?" I hesitated for a moment, then said, "I need to understand exactly where I stand, legally, with Mark and Melissa's house. And I think Melissa might be looking into things she shouldn't be." Harold raised an eyebrow and motioned for me to sit. I handed him the folder, explaining my financial contributions and what I'd overheard. He reviewed the documents carefully. "Linda, the house is legally under Mark and Melissa's names as joint owners. However," he flipped through my bank statements, "these transfers you made to Mark, especially the ones clearly marked for mortgage payments, could establish a financial interest, at least informally. It's not straightforward, but it's not nothing either." I felt a small spark of relief. "So I'm not completely without standing?" "Not entirely," Harold said. Then his expression changed. "And I should tell you, Melissa came to see me about 6 months ago." I froze. "She did?" "Yes. She asked general questions about asset division, how property is divided in the event of marital issues, and what rights a spouse has in relation to jointly owned assets." My pulse quickened. "Did she mention me?" Harold shook his head. "Not directly, But the timing, Linda, it's worth paying attention to. If she's thinking about changing ownership, you need to be prepared. I left Harold's office with a mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt validated. Melissa's actions weren't in my imagination. On the other, the risk felt more real than ever. That evening, when Melissa left for a late work meeting, I offered to clean up the kitchen. As I was putting away some mail she'd left on the counter, a single envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to her, marked, "Past due." I hesitated, then slid it quietly into my pocket. Later, alone in my room, I opened it. My stomach tightened as I read the words. Outstanding balance, 14/3/27. A credit card statement full of charges, designer clothing, luxury dinners, and a few cash advances. The next day, while Melissa was on the phone in her office, I passed by and noticed a small stack of unopened mail on her desk. I didn't touch it, but the red markings on some envelopes were hard to miss. Debt. Significant debt. Pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. If Melissa was in financial trouble, her interest in securing control of the house and possibly selling it made even more sense. That night at dinner, she chatted breezily about a dream home she had seen online. Mark smiled, indulging her excitement. "Maybe someday," he said, shaking his head as though it were a far-off fantasy. Melissa's smile didn't falter, but her eyes told a different story. I excused myself early, retreating to my room with my thoughts. Melissa was in deeper trouble than anyone realized, and she was playing a long game, one where I could be pushed out quietly, piece by piece, until I had no claim to anything. But now I had something I didn't have before, knowledge. Knowledge of her debt, knowledge of her visit to Harold, knowledge that she wasn't as secure as she appeared. It wasn't time to act yet, but the scales were shifting. For the first time since that dinner, I felt a flicker of control returning to me. I spent the next few days thinking about everything Harold had told me. Melissa's visit to him months earlier haunted me. She'd been laying groundwork in ways I hadn't imagined. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to dig deeper, not just into the present, but into the past. One afternoon, I visited my old house again, this time heading to the locked cabinet in the garage where Robert's legal papers were stored. I pulled out the thick folder labeled Estate of Robert Parker. I sat at the small folding table, papers spread out before me. My heart skipped when I saw a section titled Property Provisions. Reading through, I found something I had forgotten. Robert had specifically written that our primary residence, the very house Mark and Melissa lived in, was to remain in my sole control for as long as I lived. It could not be sold, transferred, or placed under another name without my explicit written consent. I sat back in my chair, stunned. It was as though Robert had anticipated something like this might happen. For the first time in weeks, I felt a rush of relief. I had a legal shield, but the relief didn't last long. As I continued reading, I came across a clause I hadn't noticed before. It stated that if the property became jointly owned due to any financial restructuring, co-signing, or marital arrangement with Mark, certain rights could shift. I froze. That was the opening. That was the crack in the armor. If Melissa could persuade Mark to restructure ownership, perhaps under the guise of refinancing or consolidating debts, she could position herself closer to what she wanted. Suddenly, her constant handling of bills, her subtle control over financial matters, her dream house conversations made a dangerous kind of sense. My pulse quickened. What if she had already been preparing Mark for that conversation? He was trusting, especially when it came to her. And if she framed it as something practical, something that benefited the family, he might agree without thinking twice. I closed the folder, my hands trembling slightly. The safety I had felt just minutes ago was gone, replaced by a gnawing urgency. That night at dinner, Melissa chatted about mortgage rates, casually dropping comments about how smart it would be to consolidate while rates are still low. Mark nodded along, distracted but agreeable. I stirred my soup, forcing my face to remain neutral. This wasn't just speculation anymore. She was already planting the seeds. After dinner, I returned to my room and took out my own notebook, creating a timeline of everything I had noticed since moving in. The room switch, the kitchen restrictions, the financial control, the comments to neighbors, the dinner remark, the conversations about selling. And now, this. The pattern was clear. Melissa wasn't acting on impulse. She was executing a plan. And while I had the legal advantage of Robert's will, I now understood that her target wasn't the current ownership. It was reshaping ownership so the will's protection no longer applied. I needed to move faster than she did. The next morning, I called Harold again and told him what I had found. He wasn't surprised. Linda, that clause could be a vulnerability if Mark were to change the structure. You need to protect against that possibility. How? I asked. There are ways, he said carefully, but they require preparation and discretion. As I hung up the phone, I felt the weight of both hope and fear pressing on me. Hope, because I still had a path to protect myself. Fear, because Melissa was already several moves into her game. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about my place, my security, my dignity, and I wasn't about to lose any of them without a fight. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the steam curling from the cup. My mind wasn't on the taste or the warmth. It was on Harold's words. Protect the house before Melissa could act. After breakfast, I called Harold again. I need to move the property into a trust, I said plainly. He didn't hesitate. That's the best way to secure it. Once the house is in a trust with you as the trustee, no one can force a title change without your consent. Not Mark, not Melissa. I felt the first true breath of relief I'd had in weeks. Let's start right away. Over the next few days, we worked quietly. I gathered documents, signed papers, and prepared the legal structure. Harold assured me everything would be airtight. Melissa wouldn't see it coming. But life has a way of adding new twists at the most inconvenient times. One Tuesday afternoon, I was heading to the kitchen for tea when I heard Melissa in the living room. Her voice was low, cautious, but I caught enough to freeze me in place. Yes, I'll see you Thursday at 3, she said into her phone. No, my husband doesn't need to know. This is just to review some potential changes to our assets. Assets? I stepped quietly back into the hallway before she saw me. My heart pounded. Thursday at 3. Melissa was meeting another lawyer, and she didn't want Mark to know. That evening, I retreated to my room and stared at the calendar. Thursday at 3 meant I had less than 48 hours to finalize my trust paperwork. If she was accelerating her plan, I had to move even faster. The next morning, I met Harold again. We have to complete everything by Thursday noon, I said. Melissa has an appointment that afternoon. I need the trust established before then. Harold nodded. We'll make it happen. By Wednesday night, everything was ready. The trust was finalized, notarized, and filed. My house, the house Robert and I had built a life in, was legally locked down. But my plan didn't end there. I knew Melissa would keep pushing, and I wanted her to know in no uncertain terms that her games were over. But the confrontation couldn't be rushed. It had to be strategic, public, and final. That's when I decided on the family dinner. Thursday evening, after Melissa's mysterious meeting, I told Mark I wanted to host a special dinner on Saturday. Just family, maybe a couple of close friends and neighbors, I said casually. It's been a while since we've all sat down together. He smiled, relieved at the idea of something normal. That sounds great, Mom. I'll let Melissa know. Melissa, when she heard, smiled that polished smile of hers. Of course, I'll help with the menu. Inside, I kept my own expression calm, but my mind was already arranging every detail. I wanted this dinner to feel like a celebration until the very last moment, when it would turn into the stage for my reveal. I pictured Melissa in her confident hostess role, unaware that the ground beneath her had already shifted. I imagined the look on her face when I presented the trust documents in front of witnesses and made it clear that her schemes were over. It wouldn't just be a legal victory, it would be a turning point. On Friday, I made a trip to my old house to retrieve a few sentimental items: photos, my favorite serving dishes, and Robert's leather folder, the one that held the signed trust papers. I placed it carefully in my bag, knowing it would play its part on Saturday night. Back at Mark and Melissa's house, I kept my demeanor pleasant. I cooked dinner, played with my grandson, and even complimented Melissa on her choice of wine for Saturday's gathering. She smiled, clearly pleased, and I could almost see the confidence radiating off her. She had no idea what was coming. In the quiet of my room that night, I rehearsed what I would say. It had to be measured, calm, unshakable. There would be no shouting, no ugly scene, just facts presented with the finality of a door closing. I glanced at the folder on my desk, its edges neat and unassuming. Inside, it carried the weight of my future, my home, and my peace of mind. Saturday night couldn't come soon enough. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, the kind of spring evening that made everything look deceptively peaceful. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic as Melissa bustled in the kitchen, humming to herself. Mark had picked up wine from the local store, and the table was set with Melissa's finest dishes. She was in her element, greeting each arriving guest with her polished smile. I moved quietly in the background, greeting neighbors and close friends as they arrived. Among them was Mrs. Whitaker, who had always been observant, and Harold, whom I introduced as an old family friend. I had arranged the seating so Harold would have a clear view of the table when the moment came. Melissa looked radiant, confident. She wore a deep green dress, her hair perfectly styled. It was obvious she saw tonight as another opportunity to reinforce her role as the perfect hostess. Mark, as usual, was a little distracted, but he seemed happy to see everyone together. "This is nice, Mom," he said to me as we carried in the last dish. "Feels like old times." "Yes," I said, smiling faintly. "Old times." Dinner began pleasantly enough. The conversation flowed easily. Neighbors complimented the food, Mark shared a funny story from work, and Melissa laughed in all the right places. I kept my own laughter light, my tone calm, my posture relaxed. No one suspected the undercurrent running beneath my composure. About halfway through the meal, as plates were being cleared, Melissa set down her wine glass and stood, smiling broadly. "I have some exciting news to share," she announced, her voice carrying just enough to silence the room. I tilted my head slightly, watching her closely. Melissa clasped her hands together. "Mark and I have been talking, and we think it's time to make things official with the house. We've been looking into refinancing options and, well, we think it would make sense to have the property title aligned with our financial plans for the future. It's the smart move for the family." She glanced at Mark, who looked slightly startled but didn't speak. "And of course," Melissa continued, "we want everyone here tonight to know that this is about security. For all of us. Linda, you've been such a help to us, and we want to make sure everything is handled properly." It was a subtle trap, presenting it in front of family and neighbors, framing it as a generous, forward-thinking decision. I could feel eyes turning toward me, waiting for my reaction. I took a sip of water, my hand steady. "That's quite a proposal, Melissa," I said evenly. She smiled, clearly expecting hesitation, but also thinking she could talk me around. "It's just a formality, really. The bank prefers streamlined ownership for refinancing. It's common sense." I let the silence stretch for a moment, then slowly rose from my chair. "I think tonight is a perfect time to talk about the house. After all, we have so many friends here, and since this involves my home, it's only fair to be transparent." Melissa's smile faltered just slightly. "Of course," she said, her tone still smooth. I walked to the sideboard where I had placed a plain leather folder earlier that day. Picking it up, I returned to the table, laying it flat in front of me. "You see, Melissa," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly through the room, This home has always been protected. Robert and I took steps years ago to ensure it could never be taken from me without my consent. That hasn't changed." Melissa's brows knit slightly, confusion flashing in her eyes. "I don't understand." I opened the folder and pulled out the trust documents. "This house is no longer under individual ownership. As of Thursday, it is secured in a trust with me as the sole trustee. That means there will be no refinancing under new names. No title changes. Not now. Not ever." The room went silent. Melissa's smile froze in place, but her eyes widened, the confident gleam dimming. "A trust? You did this without telling us." "This is my home, Melissa," I said, my tone firm but controlled. "And yes, I did, because I've learned that sometimes silence is the only way to protect what matters." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I turned to him. "Mark, this isn't about shutting you out. It's about ensuring stability. Your father wanted me to be secure, and I intend to honor that." Harold, who had been quietly observing, spoke up from the far end of the table. "A trust is legally binding. Any attempts to alter ownership without the trustee's consent are invalid. Linda's taken a very prudent step." Melissa's face flushed. "This is completely unnecessary. I was only thinking about the family's future." I met her gaze steadily. "The family's future is safe, Melissa. The house is safe, and there's nothing more to discuss." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint clink of silverware as someone set down a fork. Melissa's polished composure cracked just slightly. She reached for her wine glass, but her hand wasn't as steady as before. Around the table, I could see the neighbors taking in the scene, their eyes moving between Melissa's strained smile and my calm certainty. I sat back down slowly, folding the trust documents neatly and sliding them back into the folder. The air felt different now, still, but charged. Dinner continued, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Melissa's confidence had deflated. Mark was quiet, processing. The neighbors sensed the change, though no one spoke of it directly. And me. I finally felt something I hadn't in months. Control. Melissa's glass clinked faintly as she set it down, her smile brittle. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she began, her voice still carrying that smooth tone she always used when trying to manage a situation. "I never meant to create any tension. My suggestion tonight was just about what's best for everyone. Maybe I didn't phrase it well." Her eyes darted briefly to the neighbors, then to Mark, who was staring down at his plate. Mark finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Melissa, did you know Mom was going to put the house in a trust?" Melissa hesitated. "No, of course not. That's exactly why I think we should all be having these discussions together. I mean, look at this. Plans being made without talking to each other. It's bound to cause confusion." I could see her trying to spin the situation back in her favor, but this time, the ground she was standing on wasn't solid. "Melissa," I said, my voice calm but cutting through her words, "this isn't about confusion. It's about clarity, and I think it's time we stop pretending there's been a simple misunderstanding." Her eyes narrowed slightly, though she kept her voice polite. "I don't know what you mean." I leaned forward, resting my hands lightly on the folder in front of me. "I mean, I know. I know about the conversations you've had, about selling this house, about transferring the title, about moving to a new place in your name and Mark's. I know about your visits to lawyers, both the one you met months ago and the one you met just this past Thursday." The color drained slightly from her face. "And I know," I continued, my tone steady, "about the debt, the credit card statements, the cash advances, the plans to use the sale of this home to solve a problem you didn't want to share with anyone." Across the table, Mrs. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between us. Harold remained silent, but his expression said he understood exactly where I was going. Melissa's voice was sharper now, but still restrained. I don't appreciate being accused in front of everyone. This isn't an accusation, I replied evenly. It's a fact. I've spent weeks listening, watching, and gathering everything I needed to understand the situation. And tonight I wanted to make it clear that this house, my home, is not part of anyone's plan to quietly disappear into someone else's name. Mark's head lifted sharply at that, his eyes turning to Melissa. Is this true? You've been meeting with lawyers about the house. Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Mark, I was just trying to protect us. We've been talking about refinancing for months, and I thought... You thought you'd take the title out of my mother's control. His voice was low, but heavy. I thought, Melissa said, her voice rising slightly, that we needed to secure our future. And I was going to tell you when the time was right. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the dining room clock. I sat back in my chair, letting the moment settle. Melissa, I said softly, you've had every opportunity to be honest. I didn't want this to turn into a spectacle, but I also wasn't going to let things go on without addressing them. Tonight, everyone here understands the truth, and more importantly, they understand the outcome. Melissa's eyes glistened, whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. She reached for her wine glass again, but her hand trembled slightly. Mark remained quiet, the weight of the situation settling heavily over him. For the first time, he looked like he truly saw what had been happening, not just isolated moments, but the full pattern. I folded the trust documents back into the folder and placed it gently on the table. This is finished. The house is secure. There will be no refinancing, no title transfers, and no more hidden plans. Melissa didn't respond. Her silence was an admission in itself. Around the table, the guests shifted, sensing that the confrontation had reached its natural end. Conversation picked up again in quiet tones, but the atmosphere was changed. For me, there was no gloating, only a quiet satisfaction. The danger had passed, and in that moment, for the first time in months, I felt my home was truly mine again. In the days that followed the dinner, the house felt different. The air was quieter, conversations more measured. Melissa still moved through her routines, cooking, organizing, tending to the household, but the confident edge she once carried had softened. She spoke less in absolutes, less about our house or future plans, and more in the language of cooperation. Mark had also changed. His demeanor with me shifted in subtle but important ways. He began checking in more often, not in a perfunctory way, but as if he was truly paying attention. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room, he cleared his throat. "Mom," he began carefully, "I want to apologize. I should have spoken up sooner. I didn't realize how much this was affecting you." I looked at him, my son, who had always been good-hearted, but sometimes too trusting. "Mark," I said gently, "I don't need an apology. I need understanding and boundaries." He nodded. "You'll have them. From now on, no decisions about the house or about you are going to be made without you being part of it. I'll make sure of that." It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Melissa, for her part, seemed intent on showing a new side of herself. She offered to cook my favorite meals, asked if I wanted to join her on errands, even brought me flowers one afternoon just because. It was a clear effort, but I knew better than to mistake politeness for transformation. One evening after dinner, she approached me as I was drying dishes. "Linda," she said softly, "I hope we can move forward. I know things got tense. I want to make this a comfortable home for you." I studied her face, searching for sincerity. "Melissa," I said evenly, "this is my home. I'm allowing us all to live here together. That will continue, but only under certain conditions." Her eyes widened slightly. "Conditions?" "Yes." I set the dish towel down. "First, There will be no conversations about refinancing, selling, or changing the title. Ever. Second, all major household decisions will be discussed openly with me included. Third, boundaries will be respected. My space, my routines, my role in this family, those aren't negotiable. Melissa swallowed, then nodded. I understand. I wasn't sure she liked it, but she accepted it. And that was enough for now. From the outside, life began to look normal again. Neighbors still waved from their porches. Family dinners continued, though now with an air of deliberate civility. Melissa was still courteous, Mark was still busy, and I went back to tending the roses, volunteering at the library, and walking my grandson to the park. But beneath that surface, I remained alert. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. I noticed the small things. Melissa hesitating before opening mail when I was in the room, Mark glancing at me when financial matters came up. The tension wasn't gone. It was simply managed. One quiet Saturday morning, as I watered the garden, Mrs. Whitaker called over the hedge. "Linda, I have to say it's nice seeing everyone getting along again." I smiled faintly. "Yes, things are calmer now." She tilted her head slightly. "You handled that dinner well. Most people wouldn't have been so composed." I chuckled softly. Sometimes composure is the best tool you have. Inside the house, Melissa was playing with my grandson in the living room, her laughter carrying into the yard. I watched her through the window for a moment. She was good with him. No one could deny that. And for all the tension between us, I didn't want to create a home filled with hostility. That was why I hadn't asked her to leave. Not yet. Because while I could protect my house with legal documents, protecting my family required a different approach. Mark loved his wife. My grandson loved his mother. For now, the best path forward was not eviction, but firm boundaries. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, Melissa asked if I'd like to host Thanksgiving at the house that year. "We can invite your friends, too," she said with a smile. I studied her carefully, then nodded. "Thanksgiving here will be fine. But remember, this home is under my care. The guest list, the menu, the arrangements, they go through me." "Of course," she said quickly. It was a small exchange, but it carried the weight of the new dynamic in the house. Life had shifted. On the surface, we were back to being a family, but the unspoken truth was that the power in the house had been rebalanced, and I intended to keep it that way. A few months passed, and life settled into a steady rhythm. The rules I'd put in place held firm. Melissa kept her distance from financial matters, Mark respected my boundaries, and the house felt safe again. It wasn't perfect, but it was balanced. One afternoon, I was at the library shelving books when Carol, one of my friends from the neighborhood, approached me. "Linda, have you heard about the Women's Circle at the community center? They've been inviting speakers to talk about life transitions, family issues, that sort of thing." I smiled faintly. "I've heard of it, yes." "You should speak," she said, her eyes lighting up. "You've been through something remarkable. Do you know how many women would benefit from hearing how you handled it?" At first, I laughed it off. "Oh, Carol, no one wants to hear me talk about my messy family business." But over the next few days, her words stayed with me. I thought about how many women in my position, mothers, widows, grandmothers, had been invited into a family home only to feel their place shrink piece by piece. I thought about the nights I lay awake, wondering if I'd be pushed out of my own life. And then I thought about that dinner, the one where I stood my ground calmly, publicly, and permanently. So I called the community center. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing at a small podium in front of 20 women, most of them around my age. Their faces were open, expectant, a few tinged with the quiet fatigue of people who had been overlooked too many times. I began simply, "My name is Linda Parker, and a year ago, I nearly lost the place I called home. Not because I couldn't afford it, not because I gave it away, but because I let my boundaries slip." A ripple moved through the room. Heads nodded. I told them about Melissa's invitation, about the little changes at first, about the dinner where the words, "Don't act like the owner," were spoken in front of everyone. I didn't sugarcoat the feelings, how small I'd felt, how angry, how betrayed, and I told them how I'd decided to respond, not with shouting or ultimatums, but with preparation, evidence, and calm action. I described the trust fund, the family dinner, the reveal. The room was silent as I painted the picture of Melissa's reaction, of the shift in the room, of the way control returned to me without a single raised voice. When I finished, there was a pause. Then, one by one, women began to share their own stories. A widow whose son's wife had tried to move her into a basement for more space upstairs. A grandmother who had signed over property thinking it would make life easier, only to be told she was now a guest. By the end of the hour, the air in the room felt different. We weren't just women sharing complaints. We were strategizing, supporting each other. Afterward, the group leader pulled me aside. "Linda, would you consider making this a regular thing? We need voices like yours, people who can show others that there's a way forward." I hesitated, but then I thought of the look on Melissa's face that night. Not just shock, but recognition. She knew she'd underestimated me, and I realized I wanted other women to see that they could be underestimated and still win. So I agreed. Now, once a month, I speak at the community center. We talk about legal protections, about setting boundaries, about recognizing manipulation before it's too late. We even have lawyers come in to explain trusts, wills, and property rights. I don't tell my story to embarrass anyone. I tell it to empower the people who need to hear it. At the end of my talks, I always leave them with the same line. Respect doesn't come from blood, it comes from behavior. And if someone isn't willing to show you that respect, you have every right to protect yourself, your home, your life, and your peace. Back at home, things continue much as they have. Melissa stays within the lines. Mark works hard, makes time for me and his son. My grandson still runs to me when I walk in the room. There are no more comments about ownership, no more subtle moves to shift control. And though I still keep my trust folder locked in my desk, I sleep easier now because I know this. I didn't just protect my home. I built something bigger, a reminder for myself and for others that even when you feel powerless, you can take back control.